GamingBolt presents 15 games that radically changed their series' formula. The greatest video game franchises are the ones that know how to grow with the times. The things that may have defined a franchise as an industry leader become the norm over the years, and what was once fresh and new becomes formulaic. It is the franchises that know how to reinvent themselves that remain at the top of the gaming pantheon even decades after their inception. Not all franchises know how to do this successfully, though. There is a very fine balance that needs to be achieved between going with something completely fresh and groundbreaking and yet retaining the essence of that franchise. Here in this feature, we're going to take a look at 15 games that did exactly that for their respective series. Without further ado, let's begin. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. The Legend of Zelda is undoubtedly one of the most well-respected and well-loved properties in our industry, and almost every mainline game in the series has been among the best of its generation. But with Breath of the Wild, Nintendo completely redefined what it meant to be a Zelda game, with an expansive, beautiful, and deeply interactive open world and a slew of new and reworked mechanics. Breath of the Wild adds the sheer joy of discovery and exploration to the series like we've never seen it before, while managing to retain the series' trademark identity. The sheer brilliance and genius of its open world made it even more notable when you consider the fact that this was Nintendo's first real stab at a proper open world game. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. The Phantom Pain divides opinions among fans of Metal Gear like no other game in the series, thanks to its de-emphasized storytelling style and its disappointing and unfinished narrative. That said, there is no doubting that purely in terms of how it plays, The Phantom Pain is an absolute masterpiece. The game puts you in a highly systemic-based open-world environment and gives you tons of options to tackle objectives as you see fit, making for one of the most organic and thrilling stealth games ever. Many might argue that in doing so, The Phantom Pain lost much of Metal Gear's identity, and yet, despite all of its controversial issues, it remains one of the best games to have ever been released in the last few years, across all systems and genres. Super Mario 64. Back in the early days of the N64 and the PlayStation, 3D visuals in a video game were something of a novel concept. Super Mario 64, however, daringly sought to translate the Mario formula to a 3D space, and it did so with resounding success. Super Mario 64 offered the sort of freedom that we hadn't ever imagined could be part of a Mario game, while also making it an absolute joy to control Mario in completely new ways. Super Mario 64 was also the pinnacle of game design in a Nintendo title, and even now, decades after its release, it has to be one of the best games in the series. Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is truly a landmark title for Capcom's famous survival horror franchise, breaking away from the series' traditional isometric view and instead adopting a third-person over-the-shoulder approach, and while as a result it became more focused on set-piece moments rather than true traditional horror, it still retained the constant sense of palpable tension that characterized the series. It's a shame that Resident Evil 6 and, to an extent, even Resident Evil 5 took that approach in a direction that didn't sit well with fans of the series, but that didn't diminish the legacy of this seminal title. Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 6 was a low point for the franchise, and other disappointing releases in that same period, such as Operation Raccoon City, made it clear that the series was in need of a major overhaul. Resident Evil 7 came along and did exactly that. Just as Resident Evil 4 had done so by changing its perspective to third person, the seventh game in the series shifted the focus to a more intimate first-person perspective. Thanks to this, the series was able to get back to its roots and once again becoming the thrilling, intense survival horror experience we all once remembered Resident Evil as. Grand Theft Auto 3. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the video games industry would be completely different from what it is right now if Grand Theft Auto 3 didn't exist. Sure, its predecessors were decent titles, but GTA 3 was the game that gave the series its identity and helped it become the household name it is now. It's a game that has to be among the most influential in the history of our industry. While it's fair to say that the game was outdone by several of its successors, such as Vice City and San Andreas, it's worth noting that GTA 3 is, in many ways, the template on which all modern open-world games are built. Final Fantasy XII. For years and years, Final Fantasy was known as a highly focused, story-based RPG series with turn-based combat. Final Fantasy XII came along and turned that completely upside down. Sure, it had the same sense of scope and the same engrossing narrative style that the series is known for, but that wasn't its most notable aspect. Final Fantasy XII was ridiculously ahead of its time, featuring mechanics that are now norms in so many action RPGs. It featured an excellent non-turn-based combat system as well as a beautiful and large open world, making for a game that is criminally underappreciated and has to be among the best in the series. Fallout 3. Fallout 3 was a long overdue return for the role-playing series, and it was also the first game in the series to be developed by Bethesda, and was a hugely successful reinvention. It marked a shift in gameplay style for the series, going from the isometric 2D perspective of its predecessors and adopting a first-person/third-person 3D style. Additionally, it replaced the turn-based combat the series had been known for up until then, replacing it with real-time combat built around the excellent VATS system. Most importantly though, despite all of these changes, it was exactly what a modern Fallout game should have been like. Shin Megami Tensei Persona 3. Atlus's Persona subseries is associated with a very specific style of gameplay, an addictive mixing pot of social simulation, dungeon crawling, and classic role-playing. But it was only with Persona 3 that this gameplay loop was introduced. Prior to this 2006 release, the series was, above anything else, a traditional dungeon crawler, full of idiosyncrasies and hardcore Shin Megami Tensei design quirks that made the game somewhat inaccessible, in spite of their excellent atmosphere and narratives. Persona 3 kept the parts of its predecessors that worked intact and brought in a number of new elements that added entirely new layers to the experience. Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime was the series' first foray into 3D, having skipped the N64 generation after the seminal Super Metroid launched on the SNES. What a game it was! With Prime, Metroid went from being a side-scrolling game to a first-person one, and yet, even with such a major shift, it was a quintessential Metroid experience. Metroid Prime has to be, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the best games to have been released in the 6th generation of console gaming, and thanks to its modern, yet faithful take on what makes the series tick, it also has to be one of the best Metroid games of all time. Burnout 3 Takedown. The Burnout franchise doesn't have much of a future, sadly enough, but it was once among the premier racing franchises in the industry, and that all started with Burnout 3 Takedown. Burnout was a successful franchise in its own right in its early years, but it was with the third installment that it really hit peak popularity. Burnout 3 introduced faster racing, new modes, and new mechanics, chief among which was the ability to take down your opponents. This mechanic, of course, went on to become a staple not only for the series, but for a large number of action racing games in general. Tomb Raider. The Tomb Raider franchise was dead in the water until very recently. Once a real heavyweight of the industry, Lara Croft had slowly but surely turned into a shadow of herself as the years went by. It was only in 2013 with Crystal Dynamics' reboot of the series that she was able to hit familiar heights once again. Tomb Raider was a grittier, more grounded take on the iconic character, an origin story steeped in character development and slick storytelling. Its gameplay took cues from games like Uncharted, while adding survival elements to bring it more in line with its darker tone. Tomb Raider may not have done anything other games in the industry hadn't done before, but it managed to successfully put a new spin on an old and iconic character. World of Warcraft. Warcraft was, up until 2004, a real-time strategy series, and it was among the best in its genre even then. World of Warcraft came along and turned it into a huge MMORPG, and you don't need us to tell you just how successful it was in doing that. World of Warcraft remains a hugely active game even more than a decade since its launch, and undoubtedly remains the standard that all MMOs aspire to reach. Its impact on the industry is undeniably massive, and thanks to constant updates and expansions by Blizzard, it continues to be a major game in the PC community even today. Dynasty Warriors 2. Every time we think of Dynasty Warriors, we think of its traditional hack-and-slash gameplay of playing as a single, overpowered soldier who goes up against entire armies. When the series started, though, it was actually a beat-em-up. Dynasty Warriors 2 made the bold decision of switching genres, and we believe it's fair to say that the decision has paid off. The formula it adopted has been hugely successful over the years, having bled into spin-offs of major franchises such as The Legend of Zelda and Fire Emblem as well. SWAT 3 Close Quarters Battle. SWAT 3 was the 7th game in the Police Quest series, and it was completely different from anything we'd seen from all of its predecessors. Dropping the isometric real-time tactics gameplay of its predecessors, SWAT 3 was instead a tactical first-person shooter, and it was truly tactical. From proper room clearances and ordering compliance to usage of non-lethal weapons and arresting enemies rather than shooting them on sight. It truly made you feel like an actual SWAT officer and made you think about how to approach firefights rather than encouraging you to go in all guns blazing. It may not be as high profile as some of the other games we've mentioned in this feature, but it's still a title that you shouldn't miss. And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at GamingBolt, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.